Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be looking at the Östergötland, a Tier 7 premium Swedish pan-European destroyer. For this review we'll start with some history, move into analysis, run down the stats with you, and finish off with some gameplay. If you want to skip around at all, you should see some time codes in the description to help you out. If you thought my Öland review was a secret attempt to smuggle all of the Swedish destroyer development up until that point into one video, then you'll probably think this is a review that is something like my attempt to talk about the rest of Swedish gunboat destroyers, and in both cases you might be right. So we'll just pretend that you watched that video, linked in the description, before this one. So, as you know, clearly, 4 Öland-class ships were planned. With World War II coming to a close, there was a sense of optimism that Europe would finally find the peace it wanted after World War I. After all, the Allies had won, right? Moscow, London, Washington, everybody was friends. Well, Churchill let everyone know in 1946 that wasn't quite how things were going to shake out, and by 1948 the Swedes were thoroughly convinced that the only way that Russia was going to make any friends is if they held a gun to their head and said not to say anything if they didn't want to take a trip to the Gulag. Or worse. The initial plans for the new Swedish destroyers were, effectively, an upgraded Öland class, but the number of modifications needed to complete all of the updates desired for these ships exceeded the ability to fit it into that hull. How much? Well, Öland's max load was around 2,250 tons. The ship that would succeed Öland had a maximum load of 3,400 tons, owing to a heavy AA suite, incorporating twin Bofors 57mm guns, improved ASW, 2 additional torpedoes, and even a modest amount of armor on the deck and around the engine room. You'd have to up the horsepower from 44,000 to 58,000, and this big boat would still be able to reach 35 knots. Of course, we're actually talking about the Holland class, which would be the largest class of destroyers that Sweden would ever make. And that's Holland with an A, not Holland like the colloquial term for the Netherlands, which is also not to be confused with Holland being a very specific region in the Netherlands. We're talking about Holland, the southwest part of Sweden. In this case, 2 ships of this class would be built, the Holland and Småland, with 2 more built and sold to the Colombian Navy, albeit at a slightly modified configuration. The Östergötland actually succeeds the Holland class. As the Swedish Navy entered the 1950s, they were looking to continue to expand the fleet, but do so economically. When the budget only allowed for an additional 3 Holland-class ships, the Swedish Navy was like, yeah, we really were set on 4. Looking back to the Öland again, they considered just how much of the Holland they could cram into the Öland design. Though it may seem like a step backwards, part of the reason that they could do this was that though the disposition of the Swedish Navy had not necessarily dramatically improved during World War II, the German Navy was basically a non-entity. The Soviet Navy had started weak, effectively continued to do everything wrong during the war, and ended up weaker on the other side of it. And the various nations in between those two weren't expected enemies to begin with, and had also been battered by the war, followed by occupation. Elements of the Swedish Navy at this point actually compare favorably to any rival in the Baltic. By Sweden's own assessment, though expensive to operate, the Tre Krona class cruisers can put out a better violence of firepower than contemporary Soviet cruisers, and the Holland class destroyers were just better than those in the Red Fleet. And that would remain true up until deep into the 50s, if not several years into the 60s. Basically, the next class of ships was designed to simply be better than most of the belligerents they expected to face. And those were all Soviets. Sweden may be neutral, but it knows what's up. And if they couldn't afford as many Hollands, the proposed class would be good enough. This would result in a 2,600-ton destroyer with many of the upgrades of Holland, but losing some of the overall AA potential, a reduction back to just 6 torpedoes, somewhat lesser overall superstructure to help keep the stability of the ship, and a slightly revised hull shape and machinery. 4 ships were commissioned, with the lead being the Östergötland, and the rest taking the names of other provinces of Sweden, Södermanland, Gästrikland, and Hälsingland. I can pretty much speedrun the service history of all of these ships because the Swedish Navy is very good at doing what the Swedish Navy does, which is command a massive coastal artillery array backed up by destroyers, frigates, and motor torpedo boats, carefully hidden away in ship pens, carved into solid stone, and rated for nuclear blasts, then quietly supporting all of this with some of the most advanced and stealthy diesel-electric submarines in the world. Over the course of 25 years following World War II, the Soviet Union would produce enough hulls to be clearly the on-paper dominant force, but they still didn't screw around too much with the Swedes. This would change somewhat in the later 70s, and by 1981 the Soviet Union was confident enough to do some low-level effing around. But they still didn't want to do a lot of finding out when their Soviet submarine, the U-137, washed up on the shores of Sweden, coincidentally inside the security zone of Karlskrona, Sweden's largest military port. The Soviets claimed that the U-137 had suffered a navigational error, missed several islands and dodged dozens of shoals, and just so happened to be in the most restricted waters around Sweden. When the Soviets were thinking maybe they were on a 2 or 3 on the chart, the Swedes were definitely pointing north of 8. In part because of the countless suspected trespasses that had preceded this, and at that point the Red Navy was happy to admit to all manner of incompetence, that maybe, and this isn't a joke, that the captain was drunk, that the crew wasn't well trained, that the ship was poorly built, but if they couldn't please have it back. Ultimately they got it, but only after the Swedes had sufficiently embarrassed Moscow, intentionally or otherwise. Now, to be fair to the Soviet Union, which is something that I don't often say, a lot of why Sweden was able to do that was because the Soviet Union liked to pretend that they were a stabilizing force in the Baltic. Even if all of their friends hated them, and even if there was a little bit of unrest in Poland concurrent this issue, but still nuking your neighbors is bad for the propaganda, particularly if you were innocent the whole time. I'll leave some links if you want to know more about that incident, creatively referred to as Whiskey on the Rocks, because it was a Whiskey-class submarine that drove up onto rocks. Get it? This was originally coined by a Swedish reporter, and it is now the name of a show that will be coming to Hulu tomorrow, actually. It's a comedy, kind of like The Death of Stalin, I guess, and the movie by the same name. By this point, the Östergötland class were all in the twilight of their career. That said, they had been upgraded over time with the removal of several Bofors guns and the addition of Robot 07 launchers, perhaps better known as Seacat anti-aircraft missiles. It was probably a pretty exciting way to go out. The U-137 incident happened starting on October 27, 1981, and the Swedes kept that boat right where they wanted it for 10 days. The following year, all 4 ships of the Östergötland class were decommissioned and then were later scrapped. Now, as we move into analysis, to reiterate, this video is largely a pretense to talk about Swedish naval history. The best way to tell if you like this ship is to play the tech tree version, because it's the same once it's fully upgraded, but for the sake of folks who may want to buy this without having played the Swedish tech tree line, or maybe have the Öland, and that it might be just a little weird for it to end here. The video will continue. So what's Östergötland good at? Well, for one, it's got amazingly fast firing guns, and though the 7% fire chance doesn't seem high, it's definitely high for guns that shoot this fast. Likewise, it also has torpedoes that are very fast, and theoretically that makes it easier to hit with them. Then, just like Öland before it, the Östergötland also comes with 2 heels, which gives you an ability to hang in there longer, provided you don't get deleted too quickly. But getting deleted is a bit easier when you don't have a smoke screen, and it forces you to consider when you want to engage, because you can't as easily disengage. And if you get your impressions on a country's navy from video games, you might come away with the impression that all the Swedish research into fish was to create delicious candy, because the damage on these Swedish torpedoes is just about nothing. For better or worse, they launch in narrow and very narrow spreads. Also, it's arguable that Östergötland sits in a strange place where it seems to be telling you to get into a gunfight, even though your kit lacks some of the useful tools you'll need versus every other destroyer that enjoys doing that, while also having fast torpedoes, which makes it more attractive to run as a torpedo boat. Now, it's my opinion that folks who like these sorts of ships and find success in them do so by attrition. You have a lot of opportunities to start flood with those fast torpedoes and reasonable reloads, and then also fast firing guns to follow up with a lot of fire. The damage over time works both ways. The heals help you recover if someone hits you while you're doing this, and it's really a playstyle that folks should be familiar with before buying into this kind of ship. And thankfully, you can enjoy all the benefits of this sort of gameplay by just playing the tech tree. You just make less money. It's not even real money. But as we drill down into stats in particular, you're going to notice a lot of similarities if you have a fully upgraded Östergötland. So this is really just talking about how that ship fits into the field. Where survivability is concerned, Östergötland starts with a pretty unimpressive amount of hit points, just 15,800, so anything you can do to get that number up will help. In part because you're going to get that much more back with your consumables, but also because you're a pretty good gunboat, and before we get into that, we'll just have to finish up with the armor scheme. There's nothing too impressive here. 6mm on the superstructure and then 20 on the hull. That's basic destroyer stuff for anything pens you basically all of the time. Now, the guns are 2x2 120mm Bofors guns. They have a very fast 2.3 second reload and start off with a relatively high 7% fire chance among destroyers with a sub 3 second reload. Similarly, your damage per second is high enough to put you in the top 4. That makes you top 20% for HE DPM, even if the small guns might hurt you a bit here and there. 2200 for AP isn't going to do you a lot of favors, but against destroyers and some lightly armored cruisers, it still is very good on paper. And sub 5 kilometers, citadels are possible on some of those targets. The 10.9 kilometer range is dead average, and the only thing that doesn't quite line up with a gunfighter is this 18-second turret rotation, which is kinda bad. You have 2 racks of torpedoes. These, curiously, mount 4 torpedoes, probably for balance purposes, similar to other pan-European destroyers. These are very fast, 86 knots, and have a very strong 13.5 kilometer range. Your 100-second reload is comfortably average. Overall, though, this gives you not exactly the worst DPM, but it's pretty close. And to make this work as a torpedo destroyer, you are going to have to land those hits. The anti-air on Östergötland is rumored to be pretty good. The 232 total DPM splits between 49 at 5 kilometers and another 183 at 3.5. That won't quite compare with Friesland, but you do come with DFAA. That means that you can actually outdo the other premium pan-European destroyer for very short periods of time, at least a couple times per game. The one downside is that you do have to consider when looking at the state of this is that you can't retreat into smoke, so you're going to have to manage whether your AA is on or off, then when to dodge and when to fight as necessary. Jumping next into how well you'll be doing that running and dodging, you're pretty good. At 35 knots, you're not exactly fast and limp in with about 2.4 knots behind average. You come in with a tight turning circle at just 610, and 3.2 on the rudder is relatively good, but in a field where virtually everything is good. And finally, you have your concealment. It is just slightly better than average, 100 meters better by both sea and air. Keep in mind that the 3.4 is a lot shorter range than your AA, so again, you may want to toggle that on and off, and if you should get the opportunity to fire in smoke, 2.4 is 200 meters better than average, but that isn't going to come up all that much unless you steal some poor dead DD smoke. It actually happens quite a bit. All of this is probably going to sound pretty mediocre, but some of this is going to be made up by consumables, or at least it has a slightly different flavor than most. You've got your average DD damage control party, you back it up with 2 engine boosts at just 8% improved speed and 2 minutes on the duration. This is totally normal. You get 2 short heals. By default, these will help you recover up to 2,058 hit points per heal. Increases in your overall HP will increase the amount recovered, so something to consider there again. Finally, you come with an AA consumable, improving your DPS by 200% for 40 seconds. This is pretty standard on a cruiser, but not that many destroyers have it, and at the very least, it can feel like a bit of a consolation prize for being in a carrier match, and if you do shoot down any additional planes, that is definitely consolation XP and credits at the very least. So here we go, getting into some gameplay. We're going to be on Two Brothers. We cut to almost a minute into the game. For reasons I don't remember. I was not paying attention. I don't know what to tell you. So game starts for me. As you can see, we're very lucky. There is a Kaga on the enemy team. Very lucky is that it's not another carrier, I guess. Worst case scenario, we're starting out closer to other ships that have AA. We'll go ahead, put our commander up on the screen. We're trying to run this as something of a torpedo build. We'll talk a bit about that later. If I were to play this as I normally play in Östergötland, I would have the legendary torpedo module on this. I don't use those for the purposes of reviews, so this is just the normal-ish modules. I will also briefly address that I have put a different permanent camo on this because I was told by a Swede I can't use the white one because it looks silly. Anyway, what I'm going to do here is go ahead and mine that corner because people tend to hang out there. It's not a bad setup for fast torpedoes. If you think somebody's going to be there in about 30 seconds, you can go ahead and get them out there pretty quickly. You can see with what we've taken, the torpedo reload is just a bit above a minute, which isn't a bad place to start. We're going to slow down here for Karl Schoenberg because we don't want to give him what looks like a great opportunity to shoot torpedoes at us. He probably wants to shoot his guns, and you can see we're turning out because jumping in there, unless I really think I can kill him quickly and steal a smoke screen, is going to be bad. We're taking plenty of shots from multiple targets, which is one of the things you want to try to avoid as a Swedish destroyer with no smoke. That said, everybody was pretty far out there at 13,900 hit points remaining. We're not that much lower than we started with, if you don't count that we took Sims as an inspiration to give us about 2,800 extra hit points to play with. Now we do disengage as soon as we're outside of the sonar. I would like to challenge the Karl von Schoenberg. If he pushes up on me, yeah, there you go. You're going to see he's still got sonar active. We're going to turn out because, again, even though he has some pretty competitive guns, we still don't want to get shot by a torpedo. And we should lose this spot here because he definitely doesn't have 6-kilometer sonar, as much as that would be nice. We'll try to keep the Flandre lit up, and if we can, we'll try to maneuver into a position where we can actually launch some torpedoes against him. Right now we have what are considered wide spreads selected. They look like normal spreads for kind of anyone else. So we're going to overlap those just a bit. Because they are so fast, you will see a tendency for folks to overlap them a little bit, because it's a little bit easier to maybe get 4 or 5 hits on somebody at any sort of range. 10 kilometers is not where I would prefer to be shooting. I would prefer to be quite a bit closer. An interesting thing happens there because I opened fire hoping to start a fire. And I was hoping that the Flandre might damage control it by the time the torpedoes got there. but an invisible ship, I would guess the destroyer, body blocked one of them, probably on accident. So that's fun and interesting because it's free damage and it's more valuable damage because he starts with fewer hit points. Now we're trying to dodge the Kaga. We first try to head fake him that we're going out, then we turn back. It doesn't work all that well. But we've got the DFAA on, and you can see what this can do to airplanes that have terrible hit points. I would say this is kind of unimpressive. By and large, if I were Östergötland, I would still prefer to see games that don't include carriers, in spite of that theoretically being one of my strengths. In any case, we're driving up on the Schönberg. He seems to have curiously less HP than he did the last time we saw him. Open fire, he turns in, so we're gonna take an extra second to aim there. And we know as we're crossing over his bow, he didn't shoot torpedoes at us. Looks like we narrowly dodged, plus 4 kilometers. Some shots from the battleship, so that's also good. Now we're going to turn back and we're going to try to head south. You can see the aircraft carrier has that battleship spotted. I find this to be infuriating because the color differences aren't big enough, and these are the times that I start to feel like an NPC in my own head. But anyway, he'll turn from red and red to red and red when he gets spotted. There you go. We'll go ahead, put some torpedoes out there on him, hoping that he continues forward or possibly turns out to actually face our battleship out there. I don't know if he can see our battleship out there, but it looks like he's already maneuvering in towards me by the time he makes that little move. We score just the one hit, and you can see with just 7,000 damage there, not wildly impressive. You have to score lots and lots of hits to really come away with anything worthwhile. And against certain ships like Musashi, which may have, about 50% torpedo protection, depending on what skills are selected, it can be kind of pointless to torpedo them at times. So as we're sailing through C, I think the next place I'm going to go is over towards D. I feel like with a battleship and an aircraft carrier behind me, they should be able to take care of a wounded Atlantico. I am running this as a torpedo boat, and I would justify why this would be a better choice to run with a torpedo captain, even though I'm happy to mix it up with most gunboats. I just think without the smoke, it's a lot easier to rationalize firing torpedoes, so you can still contribute to the vision game, the cap game, the damage game, without giving yourself up. That's just how I like to run it. I know some other folks who think this is a bad idea because of the DPM, but with the narrow spreads, sometimes you can hit several torpedoes all at once, 7 or 8. It's pretty neat. Looks like the aircraft carrier is continuing to do most of the work back there. And I feel like that red on red is the red on red that says that the battleship can't see the other battleship. And to me, that would be annoying. But in any case, we're getting close to the enemy cap. I go ahead and stare down this flight of airplanes, and then my AA kicks in. And I'm like, oh, TacticAngel, this is a bad idea. That's true. So I turn it off. But the guy has already started to turn back in, so I turn it back on. And that is what you call a mistake. It's a teachable moment that we can all learn from the stupid things that I do. Because I saw the planes. I saw them, and I thought, oh, I hate aircraft carriers. But it didn't get all the way to the, second order thinking. I really don't want the aircraft carrier's attention, sort of thing. So anyway, he dropped on me. I'm gonna go ahead and put these torpedoes out because obviously this thing is gonna kill me here in a second. Oh, but I'm just too good at the game. That was lucky. Kaga is relatively good at hitting enemy destroyers. The reason for that is that low altitude drop thing that they do. I like it. I like it. In any case, we're heading over towards the outside corner of this because we would like to make the flight back to murder me take as long as possible. In the meantime, we cap D, doing the good destroyer things that destroyers do, which is score points, try to win the game. And as we tick down here to the end, we'll go ahead and jump into our closing thoughts on Östergötland. Believe it or not, Östergötland is one of my favorite tier 7 ships. It's hard to figure that anyone would really need to buy this ship. But then again, I've also been sort of hoping they release a premium Lightning. So maybe this is your Lightning. I even feel the same about Fletchers, but I'm thinking of a very particular Fletcher. So it's hard to say. Östergötland W, great excuse to talk about Swedish naval history. I'm probably going to watch this Whiskey on the Rocks thing. I may even drink one while I do. I might make a video about it. In any case, those are my thoughts on Östergötland or Swedish history, one or the other. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and of course, I'll see you on the next one.